Okay, so we are now recording and all right, well, welcome everybody. Like I said, my name's Elisa Wade. I'm with the United States Geological Survey. I'm with the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And today we'll have a training about climate adaptation and overview for fish and wildlife managers. So a few rules of the road. Please do mute your microphone. If you have a question, you should be able to raise your hand, and I'll try to slow down and give time for people to ask questions. If you go, again, I can't see what you're seeing, but if you go to there should be a participants, and under participants, you should be able to open that up. You should be able to see your name and then more, and you can raise your hand, clap, ask for coffee. You should be able to do a few different little things. Say yes, say no. So I'm not sure you have the raise a hand option, but you should be able to. And if not, you can use a chat box to ask a question. If all else fails, just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. So I would say, I hope you engage. I think that the original plan for this training was a little bit of a smaller workshop. This is going to be large enough that I can't do a ton of interactive topics, but I will try to make it engaging, even if I can't really have you engage. So today's plan is that there's a lot to cover. So I will skip some slides here and there. There's also some extra slides at the end of this, and they contain links for your later reference. So there are topics that I will cover in green at the top, which are kind of about climate science, models, projections, and a little bit about impacts. That's the first hour, but I'm going to rip through this stuff. And so again, the goal is to really have a high level overview and a really high level understanding, because it's important to have that background as you move forward into thinking about doing climate adaptation and climate smart planning. So the goal is really high level. I hope to leave you just whetting your appetite and wanting more as opposed to just confused. But again, there should be, I've pasted that Google Drive folder into the chat box, and I will do that at the end as well. And in there are all the slides. So you should be able to find the links, as well as a handout that somebody made for me. I haven't checked the links on that one, but that should lead you to more resources. Okay, so jumping into it here. So I'm with the Climate Adaptation Science Center of CASC. There's 9 of us now, regionally, nationally, and then there's also national headquarters. And our mission is to deliver science to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. We are regionally associated with different universities and host institutions. With the North Central, our host institution is CU Boulder. I sit in Missoula, however. So I'm going to kick off with a poll. We're going to jump into Earth climate. So the poll is how familiar, so these polls are kind of to help me guide how fast to go through some of this stuff. So how familiar are you with the Earth's climate system and climate science? So I'm going to start a poll. Hopefully you can see it. You should be able to see the poll right now and take the poll. So go ahead and answer that question. All right, whether you're very familiar, somewhat familiar, a little to no familiarity. I'll give you a couple more seconds here to vote. Nobody likes Mars better and just doesn't want to answer the question. Okay, I'm going to end here. I think I've got one more person who hasn't voted, but I'm just going to give them 5 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the polling. And I think you should be able to see that now. Can you see that? I think so. Holler if you can't. If somebody unmute if you can't see that. And so it looks like most people, there are actually a chunk of you that are very familiar. Some are somewhat familiar, and some of you are little to no familiarity. So I will go through this relatively fast. A lot of you are quite familiar. So I'm gonna, but I will try to at least kind of hit some of the big main points. All right, so Earth's climate, let's jump into that. I see a couple people jumping in. If you jump in, please do mute yourself and use the chat box if you have any questions. All right, so Earth's climate. So What drives Earth's climate? Everyone, I think, knows this, and the answer to that is the energy, and we get almost all our energy from the sun. And so the sun's energy hits Earth, it's absorbed, and it radiates back as heat. So that part about re-radiation is really important in that you think about Earth's energy balance, you think, oh, well, it's a balance, right? So in must equal out. Well, not really, because if it were the exact same, we'd be ice ball Earth. We would be much, much colder. So what happens is that CO2 is in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, and it allows energy from the sun to pass through to the Earth. Without getting into it, the chemistry is such that it just doesn't, it's like CO2 doesn't see the sun's energy. But then when the Earth re-radiates the heat back out, it's now CO2, it's based on a change in the frequency of the wavelength of how the sun's energy comes in versus out. It excites CO2, and now CO2 sees the sun's energy and it re-radiates it back out. So what you get is this big, let me get my laser pointer on here, this big refolding arrow. And that is really important because without that re-radiation, without CO2 or what we call greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we'd be really cold. So we need that. That makes our Earth warmer by about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So the greenhouse effect is something we know about and we like. So now let's talk about what drives changes in climate though, however. There's two ways that our climate can change. One is about changes in energy from the sun or changes in energy absorbed on Earth. So the way that, if you want to talk about how changes from energy in the sun, well, it's super cool. I really like it, and I'm not going to get into it at all because we just don't have time. So, but let's just say that the sun's inputs drive really long-term changes like major glaciations, but none of these really explain what's going on now. So to see what's happening right now, these trends, then we want to look at, there's two main drivers. There's land cover and atmospheric composition. So land use, land cover. Again, that's another issue that I'm not going to get into, but I think we all know that land cover is changing and there are effects from there. But a big piece of the story about land cover changing is a change in albedo. So albedo is how reflectant the Earth's surface is. And in this image, the reds are places that have high albedo, which means it reflects a lot of light. And that's because it's covered in snow or it's a desert. And so it's think of it as being white, right? So the idea of albedo is like on a hot day, you're out on the sidewalk, and if you're barefoot, then the person on the sidewalk is yelling, "Oh, that's hot!" And the person on the white sidewalk or on the black sidewalk it's hot, and on the sidewalk, the white sidewalk, it's much cooler, and that's because of albedo. So the main driver that we're seeing right now is changing in climate, and that drives our climate, is atmospheric composition. And so I'm going to go over this little graphic here, which is on the left is atmospheric carbon. Okay, that's my y-axis. And then on the x-axis on the bottom here, we have latitude is on this left panel, and then year is on the right panel. So we're going to look at how atmospheric carbon dioxide, so that's the amount of carbon molecules in the air, parts per million, one molecule for every million molecules swirling around in the air in our atmosphere, and how those change both at the latitude, but more interestingly over time. So I'm going to play this little video here. And what you see is that over time, starting in about 1970s, when things were 60s, when things were really starting to get measured really well with satellites, that we have a pretty steep increase in carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And as we start to go back in time, using other types of data sources, so, and even farther back, and now we're getting into a lot of ice core data, back to pre-industrial times, that pre-industrial was about 278 parts per million. And now we're up closer to 400. So you can go back farther, looking at really a lot of different types of data, pack rat middens and ice cores and things like that. And on average, you can see that we're that as of right now, we've gone back really far ways here, but January, so the last time I looked at it, the last reading they had that they average over the month, we were at 415 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And, you know, whether that's obviously, as you get farther back in time, you can see these big glacial cycles happening and unhappening. So the Earth is becoming glaciated and unglaciated. But back in the ice ages, it was about 185 parts per million. But we really haven't seen anything this high for probably about 800,000 years. So clearly, there's something changing in our atmosphere, and we know this is a major driver of climate. So in summary, we have known that we understand the physics of how the climate work. We know that increased CO2 should increase heat absorption. And even since maybe 1930s, 1950s, we understood that burning fossil fuels should increase heat absorption because we understood the physics of CO2. And then now, given modern day measuring, ever since about Mauna Loa, the measuring station in Hawaii, we were able to see that we could actually measure, and we've gotten quite good at measuring it. And we can see that there's a pretty big trend heading up. I want to point out that I'll put these links in orange boxes on some of these slides. And these are for you when you go back. And again, I will be pasting, and I already have pasted, but I will do it again at the end, a Google Drive folder with a lot of these resources. So you can go back and look, and there's some more trainings and information if you want to dive more into a subject. All right, so I'm going to keep going on climate change, and then I'll ask questions in a few minutes. So we know this is changing, and we know carbon dioxide should change. We know carbon dioxide is going up, and we know that we should see change, and we are seeing it. So that leads us to this idea about climate change. I want to quickly go over the difference between weather and climate. I think all of you certainly know this. Weather is a state of the atmosphere. It's short term, and climate is a statistical collection of weather conditions. So, you know, there's this saying that climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. So climate generally is referred to as the 30-year average of weather in a given place. I also want to differentiate between global warming and climate change. We hear both those words, and they are similar phenomenon, but they're just a different framing of it. So global warming is the increase in Earth's average temperature. It's a focus on global averages, all right, versus climate change, it's focusing on regional variation. And it means everything from warming in some places, cooling in others, extremes, changes in sea level rise, et cetera. So, and then also I want to talk a little bit really quickly about natural variability versus climate change. So on the left panel here, you see random variability, and that's things like, you know, Earth's system is really complex. The winds are blowing, stuff is circulating. You just get a lot of this just random variability. You know, butterfly flaps its wings somewhere else. And then what you get is these kind of periodic oscillations of variability. This could be things like the periodic change over really long terms, and how the Earth rotates on its axis, its wobble, the tilt of its axis, Milankovitch cycles. This could also be things like at a shorter time frame of like ENSO, teleconnections like El Nino, Southern Oscillation, Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And then when you add all that together with a trend, this is what you start to see. You start to see the random variability, you see some oscillations, but you see a trend with things, you know, going in one direction or the other. And here, this trend is upwards. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about climate change. It's different than this natural variability and then these large scale oscillations. So with those definitions, now we'll move on to how the climate is changing. And the system is really, as I said, complex. And I'm not gonna go into all this, but the idea is that there's a lot of noise and random variability because of all the complexity and interactions on the Earth's surface. And so what you get is you start to look at information and data over time, like annual average temperatures or sea ice extent, and you see a lot of this noise and oscillations and just wiggly lines. But as time has gone forward, because we take climate is the average over 30 years, it takes some time to really start to see the trend through the noise, for the trend to overwhelm the random and cyclic signals. And we have been able to see this, but because the trend has been going on long enough now, we're really getting to see these trends in climate that are really differentiating themselves from the signal and noise. And so we see these indicators of warming world that a lot of you are out on the landscape see and are fully aware of, like increased humidity, increased air temperature, increased sea surface temperature, some changes in migration patterns and phenology, reduction in glaciers and snow, etc. So I don't want to focus on climate change, the global warming piece. What I think is more interesting for fish and wildlife managers is climate change as a regional phenomenon and the local variability. So this is because there are a number of local controls on climate, like latitude, elevation, proximity to water, ocean air currents, teleconnections. Teleconnections, again, are things like ENSO, El Nino, Southern Oscillation, where the change in an ocean current in one place is teleconnected to changes in weather or climate somewhere else. And then there's also lots of local controls like topography, land use and cover, groundwater, biota. And so you get the joke that, if you don't like the weather somewhere and, fill in X your country, your favorite northern city, your town, then, just wait 5 minutes. And that's why you get a lot of this local variability and regionally, both in weather, but also in climate. And indeed, we know that climate is changing globally. And if we look at Montana, we are starting to see the same trends, although not at the same pace. So this is a climate stripes. You've probably seen these graphics before. This is using the reference years, 1971 to 2000. And it says, it just says if a year is hotter than the average over 1971 to 2000, then make it red. And if it's colder, then make it blue. And so you can see more red bars to the right because things are warming. And then just looking at some of the data coming out of the Montana Climate Assessment, the 2017 Montana Climate Assessment. I don't know if you've seen that document, but it has divided, I was a co-author on that, and we divided up the Montana into 7 regions, and we looked across all those regions and pretty clear trends of climate, of temperature increases. Obviously, it's a little bit different. The greatest rate of change we see in the north central region and the slowest rate of change in the Southwest, but all show a pretty clear warming trend over the past 65 years. Precipitation, the historical trends, it's not as clear of a trend, and on average, there's been no change. But what we do see is that in the north and central areas, we see a slight decrease, a slight winter drying. And in the eastern, we see a slight spring increase in precipitation, slightly wetter in the spring on the east. And we can measure pretty good trends and changes in Montana extremes. Things like warm days, growing season, warm nights, and monthly maximum temperatures, things that are about warming, about increase in the warm days, we see those all increasing. And then things that are trying to measure cold things are decreasing. So cool days, frost days, cool nights, and monthly minimum temperatures are the number of days are decreasing, of cold days are decreasing, and then the average monthly minimum temperature is increasing. And you can see that there's a bigger increase in the minimum temperature over time, over the last 60 years, than there is in the maximum temperature. So that what tells us is that our hot days are becoming slowly hotter, but it's our cold days that are becoming more quickly warmer. And what we get from that also is something that a really clear trend that we're able to look at is that, and has been measured of recent, is that snow water equivalent. So snowpack is declining in the Northern Rockies. And we see that same trend in Montana. So in summary, climate change, we can now measure and observe climate change, and pretty well because of both increases in technology, but also we've just had enough time to see the trend that it gets easier and easier over time to see the trend through the noise. So it's getting warmer. Historically, we can measure that it's getting warmer, and the same is happening in Montana. It's getting warmer, snow is declining, although there's been no clear change in precipitation in the past. All right, before I move on, I wanted to see if anyone had any burning questions. You can put one in the chat if you'd like to ask a question. I'll give you a few seconds. Any questions in the chat? Nothing burning. Okay, so next I'm going to move on to looking at climate models. So let me ask about that, about how quickly I need to go over this. I'm going to launch another poll. How familiar are you with climate models? How Earth's climate is modeled and projected, and whether you're very familiar or little to no familiarity, or if you just like modeling clay. Okay, so you should see the poll. Okay, looks like I have most of the votes in here. I'm glad there are people who like to model clay. It's good. Little less familiarity here, it looks like. I'm gonna end the polling in 3 seconds, so get your vote in if you want to. Okay, and I'm gonna share results. So the number one answer was little to no familiarity, and then somewhat familiar. So I'll try to slow down a little bit on this, and we'll jump into the climate models. Okay, here we go. And do feel free to ask questions in the chat as I'm going along, if you want me to slow down or go over something. So, I'm not going to dive super deep into it, but we'll try to talk a little bit about what climate models do. And, we've known stuff should change. We've known the physics of this stuff for over 100 years, and we can now see it and measure it. But what does that mean about the future? How do we do that? Well, we can't, the only way we can see into the future, we don't have a crystal ball, is to use climate models. So this is kind of just a cool image here of a climate model that is actually from NASA, and it's actually CO2 emissions, which is pretty cool. Picture. There's an animation of it somewhere online too. It's really neat. All right, so climate models they're just fluids physics. I mean, just, right? I don't know fluid physics either, fluid dynamics either, but we do understand how physics move and change to a pretty good degree. And so a climate model just says, okay, we've got this Earth, this round ball, it's flipping around in space. It's got a tilted axis that wobbles. It's got some frozen bits on the ends, hot in the middle, and it's covered in liquids, right? It's got ocean currents that are moving around all the time, and it's got atmospheric currents that are moving around all the time. So we can take that and say, well, what do we understand about global climate system components and how there are exchanges between the land and the atmosphere, and changes in solar inputs and oceans, and just how everything is, how things are functioning. And then we just put those into, and then we apply physics models of fluid dynamics. And what you get is a computer model that's typed up. And so obviously these, have assumptions and things built into them, and it's, but the assumptions may or may not be perfectly known, but the physics are pretty well known. So they go into a computer, and the computer then runs this model for every grid cell on Earth, and at multiple levels and at multiple time steps. So it solves these equations of multiple pieces of the atmosphere, things, all those little different parts that it's including, and solves it at each grid point. Now, this requires massive computing power. There's 52,000 grid cells cover Earth. There's 60 levels in the atmosphere currently being modeled, about 10 variables for the atmosphere. It makes about 32 million predictors for each time step. And those time steps are about 5-minute time steps, and they're rerun every time step for hundreds of years. So you get these things like the Titan, which are just these banks. There's only several, maybe 10 supercomputers in the world that can run these things. And climate models have come a kind of a long way over time. So back in the 1970s, they were really basic. It was like rain came in, CO2 went out, here's the sun. But by the time we got to, so on the right, we also included, we've increased complexity and resolution. So on the right here, you can see the resolution increasing from the first assessment report, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, first assessment report, FAR, and the second SAR, and then the third TAR, and then they decided to start calling them AR4 because they were just going to go back to the fourth would have been back to FAR. So now they're called AR4, AR5. So they're increasing the resolution of each of these steps, and they're also increasing the complexity of what's being considered in those physics models. So we've gone from really simple representations of how the Earth works to things like atmospheric chemistry and interactive vegetation and ocean circulation and aerosols and ice and clouds and all kinds of different things. So they've gotten much more complex, and we've been able to do that both because our science has improved as well as our understanding about the system, but also our computing power has allowed these changes. So what they used to be called, I think they used to be called global circulation models because they only kind of modeled circulation, but now they do so much that people tend to call them global climate models. So what do GCMs, we'll just call them GCMs. What do GCMs do well? They do a great job of nailing global, continental, and general patterns, large scale climate drivers. They do a great job with temperature and regional climate in some places. Some places they don't do as well with regional climate, but generally they do a great job with these things. They don't do so well as clouds. You'll always hear people that's the bane of a lot of these models' existence. They have a hard time parsing what will happen to clouds and how they impact things, what the sensitivity of the climate and clouds are, what those relations and feedbacks. And as a result, they don't do a great job with precipitation. And that's partly because they have such a hard time with clouds. They don't do a great job with regional climate in some places, as I said before, precipitation. They don't always do a great job representing extreme events because they tend to kind of average out changes over time. And they have some remaining issues with teleconnections, and so Pacific Decadal Oscillation, they kind of get the big signals, but they don't do a great job with the structure timing of those. So that's what GCMs do not do particularly well. I want to talk about a few definitions here before we get into scenarios, and that is the difference between prediction and a projection. So a forecast or prediction is this idea that you go from one present and you predict what's going to happen. You say, I think this future is going to happen. That's a prediction or a forecast. And so when you see a weather forecast, that's what they're doing. They're trying to guess what tomorrow is going to look like. Versus a projection is a predicted outcome, a possible outcome, given a bunch of plausible scenarios. And a scenario is just a sequence of events that define some plausible future. So you have some scenario, and then for each scenario, you have an individual projection. All right, and so you have a suite of projections at the end. None of them you're not saying you know which one's going to happen because it's completely dependent on the scenario you pick. So for the IPCC AR5, Assessment Report 5, they use these ideas for their scenarios of representative carbon pathways, RCPs. And so you'll see a lot of these RCPs, that's what that stands for. It's amount of carbon. So they came with these scenarios, there's storylines about how much carbon the global world will be emitting based on things like social systems and economies and policies. And so they have these fossil fuel carbon emissions, and they have a high scenario, lots of emissions. Here's 8.5, RCP 8.5, lots of emissions, and a really low scenario. This is 2.6, not so much emissions. And then kind of a middle of the road one, RCP 4.5, which is this idea that we're going to keep climbing for a little while, but eventually with technology and carbon capture and just better policies, we'll start to reduce our emissions and we'll eventually stabilize. So that's what those things represent. And for each one of those, they take that initial scenario and they run it through a climate model, and they get an equivalent temperature change for that RCP. So if you feed a climate model this assumption about global emissions, you get this assumption, these projections of potential climate change over time. Same thing with our, here's, 2.6, so low emissions. Here's what we think what the models suggest. And if we get we assume a middle of the road scenario, this is what the model suggests. So now, what do I want to say about this? So I wanted to say that the AR6 is coming out, and they're going to move from RCPs to SSPs, shared socioeconomic pathways. Okay, and I have a question. Isn't there a point of no return though? I thought I remembered hearing that if we didn't cut them by a certain time in the near future, global temperatures would first rise regardless, even if we did after the fact. Is there truth to this? So yes, absolutely. So, and cutting emissions. So I will come back to that in just, I have a slide that kind of gets at that. And so if I don't answer your question, ping me again, but I think the next 1 or 2 slides, I'll kind of touch on that, but ping me if I don't get to it. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about uncertainty and I'll get to that there. So scenarios, they allow for experiment comparisons. You'll probably hear the word CMIP, coupled model intercomparison project. And I had a slide, I cut it out because I thought it was too long, but that's what when they say CMIP, that's what that is. So CMIP is this idea that when that thousands of scientists and I won't say hundreds, but many institutions, all relying on one or two, one of these big supercomputers, they have these models and they run the same model using the same scenario. They run their different models using the same scenario. And that's why you get this fuzzy line around the mean here. So here's the mean for RCP 8.5, get this fuzzy line. That's all the models being run. And this is the median of that. And you get these different ideas of what the future could look like, a plausible future given that scenario. And so what you have is something like for RCP 2.6, we have this emission scenario that we're not showing it here. The emission scenario, the amount of emissions, you feed that into a bunch of models, you get all these different answers, you take the mean of that, and then they plot that on a globe. And this is what, on average, an ensemble of all those different models would look like in the future. It's a projection, okay? Now, for the red line, this is the same thing happening for RCP 8.5. Run a bunch of models, you get a bunch of different answers, and then you take the mean of that, you ensemble it, and you stick it on a globe, and that's what you're seeing when you're getting these projections. So I want to make a really important point that global climate models, the GCMs, offer no insight, no special insight into which one of these is more likely, okay? I'll come back to your question though about which one is more likely based on the point of no return a little bit, but because we don't assume to know what path humanity will take with respect to future missions. That is not the job of the people doing the climate models, okay? That's the job of policymakers and society to decide what they want to do about it. But the scenarios just represent a set of plausible assumptions about the future. This also means we don't consider any of these scenarios to be a sample from some population. There's no average scenario or median scenario, right? You can't take the average of the red and the blue and the yellow of these 4 lines. You can't do that because they're all dependent on a totally different emission scenario. There's no average scenario or median scenario that can be estimated from some collection of scenarios. Each scenario is its own equally plausible but different future. However, you can ensemble to combine within an emission scenario, and that's what I'm talking about. So you can take all these different models that are getting this envelope of uncertainty around, and you can ensemble them because they're all based on the same scenario, same emission scenario. Like the light pink around this line, that's the range of projections across a bunch of models. And the red line in the middle is the ensemble mean, and that's usually what you're seeing when you see a graphic. So, the reason that this CMIP, this coupled model intercomparison project, CMIP, is such a great development is now that we're able to run these experiments given an individual scenario, and we can start to see what different models spit out. And we can see, like here, this is change in minimum temperature December to February, mid-century, using the hot scenario, the high emissions scenario, which tends to be hot because more CO2 equals more warming. So, and I don't know if you can see this, but here, these are the names of the models. So there's like Cicero and MRI and MIROC and CCSM4. So these are from all people, teams of researchers all over the world, and they each have their own little special model about how they think the world work and how they're combining physics, their models and their physics, and you get different answers. And what's so great about the CMIP thing and this idea is that we can do a couple things. One, we can see, it really helps us to understand uncertainty, where we can see where like, hey, every single model suggests warming. Okay, so we're pretty sure on the directionality of where we're headed here. However, spatially, we get different levels of warming. We get different patterns of warming. And so there helps the results of these kind of CMIP, these coupled model intercomparison projects, these CMIP experiments, they really help us understand better how much certainty or uncertainty there is about the nature of the response, the plausible response given that scenario. So now there's a number of pieces of, I should say, components of uncertainty that come into a model. So in the first era here, what we see is we see just kind of general, everything's going up. And this is this idea about what I think of it as like, we bake this into the cake, like we already made the batter and stuff is now baking, right? So it's baked into the cake. We've already put enough carbon into the atmosphere that physics tells us it must continue warming. We can't stop warming right now. Even if we cut emissions right this second, we went to zero. It would take, I'm not getting into this, but there's a whole carbon cycle, and carbon cycle, think about like rocks coming out of volcanoes and going back into the earth. It's a really long cycle. And so it takes time for trees to absorb carbon out of the atmosphere. It takes time for the cycle to settle back down. So no matter what we did today with emissions, we would see warming. And that's what this inevitable is. And I think this graph is a little old actually, but this inevitable warming, or a little bit over 1, is like, we cannot get away from that right now, that we've baked it into the cake. So what we do over the next 10 years will bake into the cake what we see 50 years down the road. What we do over the next 20 years will bake into the cake what we see for the next 75 years. So there's a lag. And sure, and the threshold piece is once we get to a certain high enough emissions in the atmosphere, we will have baked into the cake, whether that's 2 degrees or 3 degrees or 4 degrees of warming. And no matter what you do, there's a point of return in that you can probably, that if you give the earth long enough, it has a carbon cycle. You might shift it to a whole different state of being in the process. But eventually carbon levels will probably will start to kind of I will say normalize. I don't know if they'll come down. There's lots of feedbacks there, but Sonia, does that answer your question ish? This idea that we've like, yeah, okay, great. All right, so okay, so what we see here in this era 1 is kind of, this is like they're going up. Okay, it will continue to go up. So even if we stop right now, it's going up because we've already put the atmosphere and there's a lag. Once you start to get, and so you see all this little wiggliness, the wiggliness at the beginning, that's internal variability. That's just, the system is complex. There's lots of random variability. It's just internal to the system. The way it starts to, the width of the line around, so this blue around the median or the pink around the red, that is uncertainty that comes from scientific uncertainty. That's the different models, right? Like what is a model? Like, all, what's the saying? All models are wrong, but some are useful, right? So, if we had a whole nother earth to practice on, then we'd have a really good model. We don't. So we have to kind of do our best to simplify how the system works and try to explain how the system works. So that's what the model does. It's making assumptions. We don't totally understand like how, one thing we don't know very well is this idea of climate sensitivity. So like for every, like the dose response, for every 1 degree of climate warming, I'm sorry, for every 1 additional part per million of carbon we put into the atmosphere, how many degrees of climate warming we go? We don't know that number exactly. So these models have different assumptions about that. And that's why you get, different models showing different things. So that's the scientific uncertainty. We don't know exactly. Our models are not perfect. That's the definition of model, right? It's a representation of a system. It's a reduced complexity representation of a system. We don't know everything, so we get the scientific uncertainty. Now, as you get out farther, you can start to see the scenarios diverge. And so the reason the scenarios start to diverge is because of that lag. The more you put in, the more you, and the longer you wait, the more carbon you put into the atmosphere, and the longer you wait, the more divergence you start to see. And so you get this scenario uncertainty. Are we on the red track? Are we on an RCP 8.5 track? Or are we on the blue track? Are we on a 2.6 track, RCP 2.6 track? So that's where you start to see a lot of things really starting to diverge as you move towards past mid-century and into the end of the century. And then finally, you just get this temporal uncertainty. You get a greater expansion of uncertainty over time once you start to add together, right? So here's this internal variability is when you're in a short time frame isn't very much, but as you get farther and farther out, it's not, the internal variability kind of washes out. You get the trend, and the scenario uncertainty starts to take over from the scientific uncertainty. All right. And so there's this idea that, again, we've got this inevitable amount we've baked into the cake. 2 degrees is kind of what the Paris Climate Accords are trying to keep us at. And then RCP, the hot one, 8.5, suggests we'll start to hit around 4 degrees of Celsius of warming by the end of the century. So, all right. I hope that answered some questions. I tried to spend a little more time on that. So, all right. So some best practices for using climate models. So first of all, I had a bunch of slides on downscaling. I'm not going to get into downscaling. The idea of downscaling is you take these global models and you downscale them to make them more regionally relevant. The decision-making around downscaling can be very complex. There's people who kind of study like which downscaling methods work best for a given region, and they do that by looking backwards. They say, okay, if I plug in the past data into my model and my downscale, which one best, predicts how the climate would have looked. And so, so you can, I would just say, turn to an expert if you're trying to pick a downscaling. And if you live in Montana or something, I mean, there's like a MACA model that most people use because it's known to do pretty well here. Okay, so best practices for using climate models. When you are using them, just be really certain don't rely on one model. What we don't know, there's uncertainty there. So use multiple models, an ensemble of models, and look at multiple scenarios. Maybe look at extremes or bookends or something. So again, there's no best model. Each model has different strengths and weaknesses. So talking to somebody who helps you, finding someone who help you look at data is a great way to try to assess that. And just to remember that models, they're not about making predictions or projections. So they really are best thought of as ways of assessing future risk. They are not like weather forecasts. They're just plausible futures. And there are other options. Climate models are best for when you are understanding species climate sensitivity, when you understand that. But if you don't, there are still ways to move forward. Even if you have only a little bit of information about your system or your species, you can get away without thinking too much about climate models. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. So, all right, so in summary, climate models are mathematical representations of the physical world. Global processes are well simulated. Local processes are difficult to estimate, and uncertainty is inherent. They are not predictions. They're just ways of framing future risk. All right, I'm going to jump into climate projections. I'm going to go over this. I'm just going to kind of talk really quickly about a few of the projections that we see that are coming out of our models right now. If you have a question about anything I've said before, I'll give you a second to put it in the chat. Okay, I'll keep my eye on the chat, but moving along here. So climate projections. Okay, so stuff is going to change. We've known it. We can now see it changing, and we can start to measure it. We take models, we run the information, and what does that tell us? So in very quick summary here, the models say it gets warmer. Okay, so here on the left is assessment report 5. Here's assessment report 4. This is the A2. Before they moved to RCPs, they called them just emission scenarios. And this is the low one, the old low and the newer high. And, you know, it's, there's some differences between models and about this is, and then coming from top to bottom is going forward in time. So kind of soon, mid-century, end of century. So, and generally, you know, warming globally, and it's amplified in the Arctic. That's what all the models say. And they're highly robust. All models suggest this. When you look at some precipitation models, which is what's here, there's a less clear of a story. What you see is on average a wetter planet. Most models suggest a wetter planet. The directionality is not always the same in all models, but you do see a lot of regional variability, a regional and seasonal drying. Okay, so what does that mean for Montana? In Montana, this is again is coming straight out of the Montana Climate Assessment. In Montana, on all the climate regions, they all suggest warming. Obviously over here is 4.5, so this is the lower temperature, lower emission scenario, lower carbon emission scenario, higher emission scenario on the bottom. Obviously, so more warming with more emissions, and moving from mid-century to end of century, and more warming as we move forward in time. And all models agree. What we see, you know, these are within the regions that you see most warming is in the summer. So the models all suggest, or most of the models all suggest that August will be significantly warmer. And then winters also warming up quite a bit, December and January. And you can see, look up the Montana Climate Assessment if you want to study these in a little bit more in detail. The model also suggests more really hot days, a substantial number of really hot days. Some of them are kind of shocking under like RCP 8.5. This is like upwards of 50 more hot days per year. So that's pretty big change in number of hot days. Fewer really cold days. As like I said, we suspect that there'll be fewer cold days. And then models, again, there's more variability on the models. Not all models suggest the same direction, but but when you take an ensemble across all models, mostly wetter. Some differences in the timing of that, though, with these models are suggesting slightly wetter springs and drier summers, and not that much change in precip for in fall and winter. That's what this is again RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5 down here. So both of them showing similar trends, just a different level of magnitude of that change. Some other projections, without getting into a lot of detail, you know, continued reduction of snowpack, potential for increased annual average stream flow, and then reduced over the annual year, but reduced late summer water availability, both because of decreased summer precip as well as reduced snowpack and climate warming, right? More evaporation. So increased fire risks, increased growing days, and probably increased opportunity for pests and beetles. So stuff I'm sure you guys have all heard. All right, so climate projections. We're gonna stop there on the climate projections and jump into climate change impacts. I'm really gonna go fast over this because in this size of a group, I think everyone probably has their own specific, it really gets quite nuanced when you think about different species and landscapes. And so I'm gonna just say in real summary here that when you're thinking about impacts to a system, it's really important to remember they're both direct and indirect impacts. So direct, like things like change in temperature, change in precip, change in snowpack, change in evapotranspiration. And then as important and probably more likely to, where you're starting to see big impacts are indirect indirect impacts like habitat shifts and phenology, pollinators, fire regimes, any kind of disturbance regime, invasives and disease. And there's more in the additional slides at the end. I put in some references and a few more detailed topics about impacts. The other big piece I think it's really important to mention here is the idea about ecological transformation. I think that's the piece that I would want to drive home, is that we tend to think about impacts like these kind of incremental changes. And I know most of you as managers are already thinking about this idea of ecological transformation, that this is a really standard ball in a well, so your ball's rolling around. There used to be this kind of like range of natural variability, or, that's how we used to think about things. But then, and that distance is your resilience, right? Like you can roll up and then it rolls down, and things kind of moving back and forth in the system. But what can, you get to a certain point where the ball rolls over some threshold and into a new well, and you have some new system. And that may happen from slow climate change, but a lot of times it's extremes that push you up and over the threshold. So really thinking about extremes in climate, extremes in disturbance behaviors and regimes, and how those tend to those are likely that, we don't know, but science does not know this well in any way, shape or form. Like, where is that threshold? Are there a threshold? How deep is this well? Like, when does that ball, what does it take to push the ball over into a new system? And there's some good work coming out of on wildfire driven forest conversion. And, kind of this idea that you have there's some resistance, and then you get to some fire that pushes you over. If you have kind of a deep well, you just kind of automatically come back to your previous system. But if you overcome the depth of that well with you flip the switch, then you see something totally different. And then the question is, can you have eventual recovery over time with reseeding or management actions or natural regeneration, or are you in some new trajectory of persistent transformation? So just really thinking about transformation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. All right, and then so I'm just going to summarize, impacts. Make sure you think about direct and indirect, and don't just focus on slow change. You really need to think about extremes of transformation. All right, so now, it's time for a 5-minute break. Did anyone have any questions before I give people 5 minutes to go do whatever they need to do? Bio break. Any questions? All right, seeing none, we're going to start a break. Come back in 5 minutes. This handy dandy little counter will show you when to come back. All right, thanks. Yeah, bio break. That's a good one. Okay, my timer got a little wacky there, so I either gave you more time or I ripped you off. I'm not sure. Give everyone a few seconds to sit back down. Can I get a yes check mark? So if you go into participants, see if you can do this and look at more and see if you can give me a check mark, a yes, that you're back. All right, got one person back. All right, here we go. Yeah, put up a chat. I got a thumbs up. Great. Right, so let me know if you're back. Give people another second here to give me a check mark that they're back. From break, go into participants at the bottom of your screen and click on the little check marks or yes. All right, we have, I think I'm gonna keep going. So either some people have gotten bored and left, or they can't figure out the check marks, so they're just not paying attention, but that's okay. All right, so we're gonna move on here and start moving into the stuff that we care about, the planning for climate adaptation. So we now, we're gonna give an overview and some place to start. Obviously, really getting into climate adaptation planning takes a full workshop and and deep thinking, but I want to give you a way to start thinking about the concept. So let's start first with just a difference between adaptation and mitigation. And adaptation, oh, I hear someone there. Somebody asked a question. No. So adaptation is the action to manage risks of climate change impacts. And that is where we are focused. We're not focused on mitigation, which is the words, that means action to reduce emissions that cause climate change. And there's clearly some overlap between them. This is obviously not about wildlife management, but there's often overlap between mitigation and adaptation, but we're going to focus on adaptation. So getting to the point. So how do you plan for climate and manage for adaptation? And one way that's often an easy framework to think about is this idea of climate smart planning. Here in the bottom box is a link to this Stein et al. Document. It's from 2014. It is a kind of a useful guide. And none of these, there's a bunch of these frameworks out there, and none of them are real rocket science. They're all about the process. It's adaptive management plus climate. That's what they are. So, why are you doing? So you kind of just start with why are you doing this? What ecosystem? What do you care about? What's your target? What are you thinking about? And then, you start to assess climate impacts and vulnerabilities. I'll add the word risk. We'll talk about the word risk in just a second. And then you move into adaptation options and thinking about actions for adaptation, and then you implement them and you start to evaluate and adjust like you would in any adaptive management process. So climate smart resource planning, there's a couple, maybe 5 main points they want to make, and that is that you act with intentionality, you manage for change, not just persistence, reconsider your goals, not just your strategies. That's a big one. Reconsider goals, not just your actions and the ways that you're going to approach things. Integrate adaptation into existing work and recognize limits of adaptation. Mike, I see your question. I'm gonna jump to that in a few minutes, okay? I'll get to that in a sec. I'll try to answer that. Okay, so a big one is this idea about acting with intentionality, and just this idea that in order to act with intentionality, you need to understand a bit of the climate change science models and trends. So you understand when somebody is talking about scenarios and how much uncertainty there is, and where that uncertainty comes from. And so if people say, oh, we don't know what's happening in the future, it's like, yeah, we do. It's going to get hotter. Okay. Versus we don't know what's going to happen with the rain. Like, yeah, that's true. I think it's definitely less. Just making sure you have a background helps to kind of think about acting with intentionality. And so, and a big part of, then part of acting with intentionality is then as you move forward is to assess that risk. And this is where those climate models are helpful. They help us with assessing risk. And those models are about helping us to try to think about what is a reasonable range of risk and trying to keep that as an acceptable range. And when you think, you can think about it as an acceptable range of risk as a society for about the amount of emissions. And you can think about it from a wildlife management perspective. What's an acceptable amount of risk from how many actions and the likely impacts? Or, are you about to drive a species extinct? Or is it, hey, the risk is pretty low, so I'm going to focus somewhere else. There's different approaches to considering impacts and vulnerabilities. And well, I'll also kind of combine the word of risk there. If you know a lot about your system, habitat, species, climate features, climate models and data combined with vulnerability assessments work really well there. If you don't know a lot about your system, then scenario planning works really well. And we're going to talk a little bit about both of those approaches. Before I jump into talking about risk assessment, I want to say something about these other two pieces of climate smart planning are managing for change, not just persistence, and reconsidering goals, not just strategies. And this is this idea of the RAD framework. And I think it's a useful way to think about things that all treatments cannot, that in the past, we've really thought, this is from Sherman et al. He's with the National Park Service. Can you shape the trajectory of change? And if you can't, then you're accepting that change because there's nothing to be done, or maybe you choose to accept the change. If you can manage it, historically, we've always kind of thought about habitat management as in that resist framework. Like, what are the treatments to stop the change? How do we stop invasives? How do we stop, it's trying to resist change. And really, again, I come back to that point about, extremes and transformation and thinking about that. Are there places where that is no longer reasonable? And what you really want to start thinking about is direct. So resist, accept, and direct as a RAD framework. Can you start to direct systems to a more amenable future, like, post-fire sage systems where it's all going cheatgrass? Can you really continue to resist, or is it, well, we're going to lose, whatever, we're going to lose the sage, but maybe there's some kind of, I'm making this up, I'm not a plant ecologist, but we can move to some kind of other perennial, or some kind of native or useful grass that we want to try to move forward. Can we direct towards some kind of more amenable future, given that we can't continue to resist? So I really want to put that out there, just thinking about things from the RAD framework. Kind of the idea that we're going to abandon assumptions of stationarity in our systems, that natural systems, we used to always kind of think they fluctuate within an unchanging or known envelope of variability. And that may no longer be true under novel climates. All right, so there are a lot of guidance documents and around how to think about climate adaptation. I'm not going to go into them all. There's a lot of CAS work actually goes into distilling these, and I just want to point out there's a lot of these things, and I'll try to go through some of the big overarching processes, but there are a number of places to get more information. All right. I am going to, let's see, I'm going to read Mike's question and try to answer it, and then I'm going to go into this poll. So with the threshold effect that you described, owing to extreme events, is it assumed required that the scale of the effect causes a significant feedback to climate, or is it that not required for the threshold to be exceeded? So yeah, I have a whole slide on feedbacks I didn't go over either. I don't know. I think it just totally depends on the system or on the species or system you're talking about. I think I think there are places where there does not need to be a feedback, and but we have just changed the disturbance regime so much. Like, I think about something like warming temperatures and beetles. I don't know that you have to trigger methane release from permafrost in order to have that move you into a threshold, versus fires where, well, right, you get enough fire going, you get this feedback where more fires, more emissions, hotter temperatures. I think it just totally depends. Was that, sorry, Mike, that might be kind of a vague, useless answer, but I think it totally depends on the question. And I think that, no, you don't have to have a huge feedback to move us over that threshold. I think there are systems where we're pretty sure we're going to hit that threshold and see ecological transformation regardless, and that doesn't have to, we don't have to think about feedbacks in that system, climate feedback. Okay. All right. So I'm going to ask a poll here. Poll 3. How familiar are you with climate change, risk, and vulnerability assessments? So again, same thing. Very familiar, somewhat familiar, little to no familiarity. All right. So you should be able to see the poll. I know we're in Montana, so there probably are quite a few people related to Evel Knievel. If you're from Butte. Okay, give everyone a few more seconds here. 5 more seconds. All right, and I'm going to end the polling. And I'm going to share results. And so, yeah, not a lot of familiarity, so that's good. So I'll try to go through this enough that you get some information from it. Okay. So stop the share results and move on with my slides. So we're going to look at risk and vulnerability. So, you know, this is one way to think about risk. So before we jump into this, I do want to say that there's a whole body of literature about like the language of risk and vulnerability. And so I'm going to punt a little bit here, and I'm just going to say, often we think in the, you know, and who you're talking to might use these words differently. And I do think language really matters, but we don't have time to sort it all out. So exposure and sensitivity are often, and I'll talk about what those words mean, are often combined to think about, you often call those two together, or impact, they add up to impact, and they're often called hazard. And then you add in the things you care about, the targets that you care about. And when you combine those, you get the hazard, which is exposure and sensitivity, and the things you care about, and you get risk, like the impact of the things you care about. So risk really is not exactly the same as vulnerability. It has a separate definition, but I'm not going to get too far into that. We're just going to kind of fudge and call them the same thing. And I'll also say that this language is different when talking to hazards folks, or you're talking to people about species versus humans. So just know you might get tripped up a little bit on those words. So, all right. So we're going to move into vulnerability assessments here, and I'm going to define these terms. So exposure is the degree of climate stress upon a unit of analysis. So things like climate conditions, temperature, precipitation, the variability of that, and then magnitude, frequency, and rate of change. And rate of change is often considered climate velocity. That's another way they call it. So sensitivity is the dose response, degree affected by climate exposure. And when I think about this from a species perspective, and that's what I'm talking about here, is I think about that as like a physiologic threshold. So for salmon or something, we know that, you know, from X degrees to X degrees, then you have happy fish, you go up another 1 to 4 degrees, and you start to see reduced, you know, the fertilization of eggs, and a couple more degrees, and you see their heart start to, you know, they can't, their physiological tolerance cannot handle that. So that's how I generally define sensitivity. Adaptive capacity is inherent capacity to cope and respond in an adaptive way to impact. And often I think about these things like plasticity and life history and genetic diversity and dispersal ability. Couple things, if you are talking to a human system, often adaptive capacity is like the country or the state's ability to respond. So are they, you know, a wealthy country? Do they have policies in place and laws? And we're going to think about it more from an inherent ability of the animal or the organism. And also adaptive capacity is different than adaptive management, is different than adaptation. Okay, so adaptive capacity, we use that word adaptive a lot. So climate sensitivity, this exists. People have been trying to kind of line out what climate sensitivity is. And there's this whole database for the Pacific Northwest where you can actually go in and look up. And I will note that a lot of times the climate sensitivity and adaptive capacity, people kind of merge some of those thoughts. And I think that's okay. as long as you're trying to think about both, like how that dose response idea and that inherent capacity to adapt. So, so climate sensitivity, I just want to say there are some databases and there are places where that you can actually go and kind of look them up and find some general ideas about climate sensitivity for different species. Unfortunately, that doesn't, this one doesn't cover the whole of Montana, but adaptive capacity is kind of the next frontier. And I think it's, like I said, it's difficult to parse from sensitivity, but it's often left out from climate change, CCVA, climate change vulnerability assessments. And I think it's because it can be hard to think about, it can be hard to have data for, difficult to find the data, but it's a major differential between many species. So I think it's important to at least consider it, even if you can't measure it. And this is some kind of interesting work for Lindsay Thurman. She's now with the Northwest CASC, she's with the USGS. And looking through, like here are some ideas about what makes up a species' inherent capacity to adapt. So is that things like evolutionary potential? Is it their dispersal ability, their distribution, their demography, life history, abiotic niche, or ecological role in the system? So, really starting to get down to the brass tacks about what makes a species be able to respond in a non-maladaptive, in an adaptive way to a changing climate. Now, if you want to actually go in and do a vulnerability assessment, there are a number of off-the-shelf indices, and you probably have seen these. A lot of states use these in order to do their swapping out their state wildlife action plans, et cetera, because they're pretty, easy-ish. They consider a lot of variables. You don't always need a ton of data. Some of the cons are they don't explicitly articulate your assumptions. They're harder to incorporate local knowledge, difficult to consider uncertainty or key drivers. And CCVI, I know NatureServe unfortunately uses, what is it called? Climate, blanking, Climate Whiz or something. And that's kind of old data at this point. So I worry about that a little bit. The Forest Service also has SAVs. It's a kind of an off-the-shelf program you can run. And they're basically checklists. Like they have a bunch of different variables and you go through and you say, yes, for this species, I think this is good, bad, or ugly. And it kind of helps you rank and do a comparative vulnerability assessment across many species or systems. So for that, they're really useful and they're a great way to just get yourself started. Now, you could also do kind of what I'm going to call a DIY, do-it-yourself approach to vulnerability assessment. These are much more flexible. You can incorporate kind of your local expertise and knowledge and data. They can be really time intensive, but they do not have to be. You do not, it's up to the person doing them or the organization doing them to how in depth they want to get. I'm going to give you an example here that is kind of in depth. If you want, there's a document called Scanning the Conservation Horizon by Glick et al. And they do a nice job of kind of laying out and giving some very specific examples of how to do a vulnerability and how different organizations have done one. But I'm going to jump into this example because I think it highlights a couple things that are nice about doing a DIY, your own vulnerability assessment. So this is for bull trout. This one I did with Flathead Lake Biological Station. So folks up there, USGS, and we were funded by NASA to do some of this work. So, so this one for bull trout, I think a place to start is really, the nice thing about doing one of these yourself is you can really start with the ecology. What's the ecology of my system? You're going to have to identify a system or a species or a guild or, a suite of species, and start with the ecology about how climate might affect them. And I think it's really important when you're doing it to start with a conceptual model. It lays out what you assume, what you can measure, what you can't measure. And again, you can make it as simple or as complex as you want. So here for the bull trout, we started with what do we assume? So we said all these light blue boxes are things we think that exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, we just overlapped them because we were like, I don't know, it's really hard to parse them out. So we're just going to kind of make sure we're incorporating both as best we can. What do we think really drives bull trout vulnerability from climate change? And so, things like temperature thresholds and habitat and human stressors and competition and dispersal and genetic drift and their ability to find refugia, habitat complexity. Now we can't measure all those things, but by doing this, we lay out all our assumptions about what's mattering. It also allows us to make these, we can do actual science and test some of the hypotheses. Like each line is like, you can think about it as a hypothesis that, that their habitat is, somehow their physiology or their habitat is somehow linked to some kind of outcome for them. And so you can test some of these as individual science. And it also allows you to kind of identify some major gaps in your thinking and data, where you might start to try to get some more data or do some more specific kind of on-site work, field work in order to get information. But at least we can lay out our assumptions, and then we can say, well, we can't measure all those, but we can measure these things. And here's our assumed relationship between what we think what matters, and our proxy measures that we're going to use to calculate climate vulnerability. So for the bull trout, we looked at, here's our exposure, extreme flows, and thermally suitable habitat. And then we looked at their habitat, floodplains, critical habitat. We looked at some demography, demographics, abundance, invasives, populations. And then for genetics, we looked at their allelic richness, which isn't a perfect measure, but that's what we had. And I think the main point I want to say here is that this is kind of a confusogram, but on the left is our vulnerability rank. So up here, 1 is our most vulnerable, 47 least vulnerable. All right, and then across the bottom are our population codes. So each one of these is a bull trout pop somewhere, and I can't remember what they all mean. Here's I think this is like Arrowhead Reservoir over here or something, and I can't remember them all. But these are bull trout populations. Here's Arrow, and they're divided into Upper Snake, Mid Columbia, Columbia Headwaters, and Coastal. And we said, okay, well, let's go back here. We can take the average, let me go back real quick. Take the average of all exposure, E, all habitat measures, all demographic measures, and genetics, and take the, we don't want to take the average, but let's say that for simplicity, EHDG, take the average of all these things down here, and we'll call that the full model, and that's our F here, okay? So we can say the full model is, you see where there's an F? Let's see if here's an F, okay? That's the full model. So for every population, we measure out what the full model gives us, what the habitat model, which is just exposure and habitat. So there's an H here, right? Each population has an H, and they also have a G, which is just the genetics and exposure, and a D, which is just the demographics and the exposure. And why this is useful is because it allows us to see what is driving a given species vulnerability. So like for this population, which I'm forgetting which one it is we could say that, like, okay, well, if we look at just the full model, the F and the H they're the same place. If we look at the full model or just habitat, it's the same. If we look at just those, it's kind of moderate to low vulnerability. It's in the 3rd quartile of most vulnerable populations. If we look at just genetics, it's the most vulnerable. It's one of the most vulnerable. It's really high. And if we look at just demographics, it's really low. So it allows us, by doing it this way, it allows us to parse out what's driving the vulnerability for each species, as well as get at this really important idea of uncertainty, that vulnerability, you can't go out in the world and measure vulnerability. Vulnerability is just like whatever you say it is, whatever things you stick into the pot and cook it up, and you do your model. So, if we call vulnerability this full model, it's not very vulnerable. If we call the vulnerability really about genetics, well, it's a very vulnerable species. So it helps you understand the uncertainty about how you measured vulnerability, as well as the key drivers of what's pushing vulnerability for that species. All right, so risk and vulnerability, range of tools. It's really important to think about, like, when you're looking at vulnerability, to consider your management levers. Like you want to include key drivers, but also you want to make sure you can include things in your vulnerability that you can actually do something about. Otherwise, it doesn't really help you, right? Like you could see, oh, well, genetics is driving this. Well, that means I need to increase connectivity because I have a lever there that I can actually do something about to change that part of the vulnerability. Because that's the point of the vulnerability assessment, is that you identify the most at-risk or most vulnerable populations, and then you try to take management actions to improve them. Use a conceptual model, consider adaptive capacity, consider uncertainty, and it's not the right answer. It's just how, it's an outcome of what you said the model should include. All right. I'm going to jump into one more poll here. I think this is my last poll. And we're going to jump into scenario planning. So just a quick understanding of, why don't you answer the question on vulnerability? And if you have any questions in the chat box in between, go ahead and fire them off. We'll try to take a few seconds to go through those. Yeah, I know. Oh, thanks. And I know that sometimes feds can't get into Google Docs, so you could have your child get into it for yourself. You know, maybe you could email me and I'll just send you a link. Yeah, I may or may not have a workaround. Okay. All right. Yeah, okay. Yeah, and you feel free to email me. It may take me a while, but I'll try to get back to you. Okay, and then Justin asks, I'm not totally clear on the purpose of assessing risk and vulnerability. So what comes next? So yeah, so what comes next is, we'll kind of come back to that climate smart planning. But the idea is, once you assess risk and you kind of think about what is occurring on the ground and what's likely to drive your targets, your species or your ecosystems, which ones are most at risk, and what is driving that risk, what are they vulnerable to, and how vulnerable are they? You can both start to prioritize actions, areas, and then identify what are the most appropriate actions to try to reduce that risk, to reduce the vulnerability. And hopefully I'll make that more clear, but Justin asked me that at the end too, if I don't answer your question. Okay, I'm gonna end polling. Little to no familiarity, and some people just like chaos. That's great. All right, so here's what the results look like for that poll. So most people don't have a lot of familiarity. So again, I'm not going to go too into depth with this, but I will try to answer questions here. All right, moving on. Okay, so moving into scenario planning. So again, scenario planning is like vulnerability assessment in that it identifies potential risks. It's not exactly its counterpart, but you can think about it a little bit as this idea that it's a way to think about risk and change when you don't know much about your system. I'm putting this slide in here just for a reference. It's the ACT framework, which is a lot like the climate smart planning kind of adaptive management. It just specifically includes scenario processes. So again, you think about what you're doing, you assess the risk and the effects and the impacts, identify intervention points or actions, prioritize them, implement your actions, monitor, and then hopefully you're starting to actually plan for climate change and be prepared. Okay, yeah, great. All right, so moving to scenarios. So scenarios are stories about not what the world will be like, what it should be like, but what might happen. And we already talked about this with emission scenarios, right? And there's some benefits to scenarios in that they avoid the traps of prediction where you kind of say like, okay, we know what we're going to do today. Now we're just predicting forward with some error on each side. Be like, no, we really don't know much. So we're just going to pick a bunch of possible scenarios. It tends to cover more, what's the word I'm looking for? Like possibility space, more future plausible outcome space. It also can help make sense of complexity in that if you see a bunch of stuff happening in the world, observed events, you can start to kind of put them into clusters and start to build your stories around those clusters. And it can help you kind of identify and make sense of all that complexity you're seeing out in the world. Oops, I skipped that. And then it can also help you think out of the box a little bit because you're really being forced to push yourself. And they work well when little is known about the future of the system. For managers, let's see, Mike is saying, for managers, Justin, aren't we maybe more interested in identifying and addressing the likely cumulative effects if we don't control the climate as an agency? Mike, I think that's a really good point. I think there's some good work going on, like, you know, that climate is not the main, in many systems, climate is not the main driver, right? It's actually just one of many. And you can't control the climate. You're controlling your actions in planning to those drivers and how you're managing for them. And I think the main point to remember is that that in many systems, the cumulative effects are pushing systems, but climate is a piece of that, along with some other once you add that to all the other cumulative effects, that's really where you start to get at this idea of transformational change and flipping some kind of switch, and you're really seeing a different system and trying to prepare for that. But I think that's right, Mike. I think you want to think about not just climate, but climate plus cumulative effects, and and all these things, these vulnerability assessments and scenario planning can help you think about those cumulative effects. You can apply them equally to any kind of stressor or driver. I'm going to skip this slide. All right. So scenario planning steps, pretty basic here. And a lot of them are times this is done in a workshop. So you identify what your main drivers are, develop scenarios and your storylines, and then strategies to respond to those. And then you test. Again, it's just adaptive management on steroids, some specific. So what are future possible drivers? Like for California, that you have, you know, things that when you're thinking about developing a scenario, you want to include all your possible future drivers. So things like predetermined elements, rising temperature, sea level, diverse population, critical uncertainties. You don't know what energy consumption is going to be like. How much is the ocean going to acidify? And then you have these wild cards like major earthquakes. And so in here, you could also put your cumulative effects, your other stressors and threats, and you should. Those should be part of building your scenarios. Some criteria for good scenarios are that they should be challenging. They shouldn't just be following what you've already seen. They should push you outside what your range of you know, historical variation. They should be memorable, just so you can remember what they are. They should be divergent. All your scenarios shouldn't overlap. They should be different. They should be plausible, right? They should be at least possible, if not likely, they should be plausible. And some ways of doing this that a lot of time scenarios are developed are by doing this kind of deductive 2x2 framework. So you select two axes that are of key issues. So this is a totally random example just to get you thinking about this. So like here, I think this is about some kind of global development issues. And so, you know, how regional development is happening is on one axis and the direction of the global economy. And you get these, you know, there's 4 quadrants that come out of it. And I like this one because they make pretty pictures and they're easy to remember. That's kind of that idea that you make something that's pretty easy to remember. The axes have to be independent. They can't be the same. And these are pretty easy to make. They're a little overly simplistic, but they can still do quite a bit to help you think about your planning. So another way you can think about it is on the axes, you can have impact, like whether it's high or low, and high probability or low probability. And that kind of gives you kind of ideas about what the change might look like, incremental change versus big major disruption, kind of a quick change versus a long-term transformation. A lot of times at the CASC, how we think about scenarios is that we actually put 2 things on we look at climate models to identify, well, first we talk about what are the main drivers. This is for Devil's Tower, and they through kind of expert elicitation, they came to the idea that changes in days with high precip, so these kind of extreme rain days, and then the amount of summer water deficit were the 2 main drivers for the targets they were thinking about. And so they plotted those as independent axes and said, okay, where do different models and scenarios come out on there? And said, okay, now we're going to pick some of the extremes so that we can think about making sure our actions are addressing any plausible future. And this, again, there's a report here if you want to look into how they did it for Devil's Tower. And so, yeah, so you know, there's no one way to pick scenarios, but let's say we had a Our independent axes were warm and hot. I'm not going to say cold because I think that's not plausible. Wet and dry, they're plausible. And this is very simple. I'm just kind of giving you a simple concept here. And then you start thinking about like where are, possible actions that we might do kind of address different places on this spectrum of scenarios. And you can either, how you think about which types of scenario actions you take could be, you could think about the actions you take that are no regrets, that are easy, maybe they're pretty easy, and they address that no matter what you do, you're gonna help all, no matter what happens in the future, what scenario becomes reality, you're addressing within every one of them. You're doing something to help for every plausible future. You could kind of do, you can kind of hedge your bets, kind of move around and pick actions within different parts of those quadrants. We'll talk a little bit about this later. You could plan for extremes, like, hey, we know this is the worst case scenario, and this is where we want to focus our attention. This is the thing that could really drive this population to extinction or something. So we're going to focus here. We're going to focus our actions here. You can also do this kind of, I think, kind of a mixture where you say, we're going to focus on extremes, but we're going to hedge our bets a little bit too. We're going to kind of pick a couple actions that kind of cover our bases, but we're really going to focus in either the place that we're most worried about. Seems like this approach to scenarios would be most useful for communicating to policymakers. Yeah, I think it's really helpful to communicate to policymakers, but it also helps think about decisions. And I'll hopefully have time to go through an actual example where somebody does that. So here is an example from the Northern Great Plains where folks, they looked at like these 4 scenarios of rather hot, awfully dry, wet and bursts in the jungle. And then they tried to think about, how they were going to respond. And this is this idea, like, if this happens, do we have to completely rethink our actions, or can we kind of do our business as usual? Do we just have to change our infrastructure? Do we have to completely change everything? We have to rebuild. So it really helped them kind of narrow down like what might need to happen. All right, so, and I'll try to come back to an example of how you would actually put this into implementation in just a sec here. So scenario planning, it's great for planning in the face of uncertainty. It considers plausible futures, and you can identify actions, and a big one that you might want to consider is no regrets actions. I think that's a place to always start, like things that just, they make sense across all scenarios. So let's do that action. And all right, so I should have that climate smart planning up. But so yeah, so the idea is like you identify your target, you develop, you kind of start to say, what is at risk? What are the drivers of that risk? And what are the likely impacts, either via vulnerability assessments or scenario planning or some combination. But eventually the goal is to make a plan and be prepared, and to think about adaptation actions and strategies that you can do to try to reduce that vulnerability risk given coming down the pike of climate change in combination with other threats that are happening on the landscape. So there are a number of these menus, and these are, so most Fish and Wildlife Managers have a lot of these good ideas already in their heads about what are some adaptation actions that might look like. I think it is useful that there's these huge menus being developed right now to help you think through different pieces that you might not have thought about before, and specific strategies, approaches, and tactics that you might want to take given a particular threat. So for example, there's the NIAX, the Northern Forest, I can't remember what NIAX stands for, but it's USDA, US Forest Service, and they have a whole adaptation workbook, and they have all of these topics already set out where they have a pretty nice menu of adaptation actions that you can take in response to these issues. And for example, if we look at forested watersheds, they have this whole list of like strategies, and then they have tactics, and then under each one of these expand to different actions that you can take specifically on the landscape that are either scientifically linked to reducing threat and risk, or at least thought very well, many experts agree that they are likely to affect change to support a more resilient system. So I think it's important to, there's one for wildlife that's happening, that's approaches and tactics for each they talk about maintaining, enhancing genetic diversity. This should be out within the year. Establishing and maintaining connectivity, facilitating shifts, managing interspecific and biotic interactions, planning and reducing human disturbance. So a lot of these are, these compounding threat kind of issues. Promoting habitat conservation. So, and for each one of these, they have a bunch of specific tactics and actions that you can take. I think the important point here is that no one size fits all answers of adaptive management. It's adaptive management for local conditions and local knowledge. And a lot of this is about going through the process and thinking through, what do we know and what can we do? There's also this, this adaptation partners library that is kind of cool, where you can look up, like, for your region and fish. Do I have another? I think you can. No, I don't have it. You pulls up again a list of actions and likely useful solutions to a given issue that you might see, that you might have identified as a major risk, threat, or as a problem in your scenarios. All right. So in summary, adaptation strategies there's a lot of lists and ideas. There's no one answer, and you probably know a lot of them already, but it is helpful to look through those lists of adaptation strategies, because they might get you thinking about something else. All right, so I only have a few minutes left, but what I would like to do is I'm going to try to walk through a specific adaptation planning process that happened recently, and kind of be able to ask some questions about that and talk about that a little bit. Try to give you an idea how this might all fit together from beginning to end, and what that looked like for one workshop. Any questions before I jump into that? Any kind of questions about adaptation action menus, or vulnerability or scenarios? Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to move on. All right. So this is an example. This is a project that was recently completed with the Wyoming Game and Fish, and it was funded by North Central CASC. It was completed by the Wildlife Conservation Society. Molly Cross, she's a real whiz at adaptation planning. So, and the report will be available here soon. And a lot of what they found might be very relevant to some of what you folks in Montana are thinking about. Now, I will admit this was a workshop, and this was a lot of time and effort went into this. I think the outcome is well worth it, but a lot of adaptation planning is a process. And this is kind of this is a blown out process where they've really done a good job and thought through it. But I want you to be able to imagine that some of this can be done to a lesser depth, to a lesser degree, and not quite as in depth, and it can still be quite helpful. So let's kind of do a spin around this climate smart planning circle. So first, they defined their planning purpose and scope. It's really hard to do this for every single species in the world. You kind of got to take it species or system by system, because often the issues are so different. So here they chose riparian, river, riparian, and wetland habitats, and it was for Wyoming, so the geography was Wyoming. And they said, okay, let's assess climate impacts and vulnerability. So how did they do that? Well, the first thing they had to do is kind of summarize the climate data and really understand what was the primary direction and change of given multiple models and scenarios. And first they identified like what they thought were the key driving factors from climate that might affect their species and systems. They also listed the likely impact. So they took those climate, and given that climate, and they kind of thought of them as scenarios, but they kind of didn't. You could use a scenario planning process here. They did more of a vulnerability assessment. They said, well, what are the impacts of concern? They said, well, we know what we care about most is water quality, quantity, temperature, timing, aquatic habitats and species, upland habitats, wetlands, and human water use. So there's a compounding threat. And they identified ways they might measure from that exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So And they went through and they did not do a full vulnerability assessment. They just thought through all the pieces that they might want to think about as they're thinking about adaptation actions. And this table goes on for multiple pages, but it has a bunch of good ideas about how they might, if they wanted to do a very specific vulnerability assessment, how they might measure exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. They did not do some big model. They just kept these in their back pocket about pieces they would want to refer to while they were thinking about adaptation. So then they went through and they identified possible adaptation actions. So for example, for watershed health and resilience, they thought about all the big picture things they wanted to do, the big strategies, and then specific actions that they would do that they assumed would support their strategies that would effectively reduce the risk for watershed health and resilience from climate change by doing these actions. So here's they're making sure they're thinking about management levers as a way to change things. Where can they actually insert themselves to do something? And I think it's interesting that they made sure that they thought about the RAD framework. So they thought about climate-informed modifications to current practices, and they thought about strategy and actions with increased priority given climate change. So things they were already doing that they needed to step up the game because of climate change and other compounding threats. And then also, what do they need to do differently? Remember, it's about not just rethinking your actions, but or not. They have to they rethink their goals later. But here they're rethinking their actions. Like, what do we need to stop doing or start doing differently because of what we identified as potential risks from climate change? And they did use the RAD framework, the resist, accept, and direct approach. So, for example, here they said, this report goes on and on, but for each one of those summary tables, they have this management strategy or family of actions for a specific area of concern. And they said what they're doing, where they're going to do it, when they're going to do it, and why. And they thought about, in some places, they want to resist, they want to install barriers to resist invasives coming up the stream. And in other places, they thought, this is not going to work for Pearl Dace. I don't know anything about Pearl Dace, so I can't say why, but they needed to change their management goal. Like maybe they should give up on what they were trying to do in that area. It just wasn't worth the dollar value. And they were thinking about prioritizing where they could actually make change, and given the realities of coming in climate and the combination with invasives. And finally, obviously, this only gets them so far. They have this really great plan. They still have to put it into, they have to implement all those priority adaptation actions. And they have to track that action and actually adjust and hope it has some kind of effect. And that's where the rubber is obviously going to meet the road. But they are now prepared, given different types of climate futures, and to start thinking about it. They're going to start taking actions that are climate informed. And they at least have some idea about how they might prioritize actions, change goals, given what they think might be happening in the future. So that was my very quick spin around the climate smart conservation planning. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks for your time. I hope that was mostly useful. There are a number of, in the handout that I gave you, there's a number of extra slides, and some of them have more information. I'll let you peruse those. And I thought if we only have a few minutes, but I wanted to see if there are any questions. And then when do you start doing that Wyoming thing in Montana? Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a great idea. And I think, the CASC is interested in doing that, and we would be happy to have that conversation with you. So, when somebody's ready, it does take time and it does take involvement, but I think it really pays off, and you don't have to do it every year. That's for sure. So any other questions? And if you have a question that's hard to type, feel free to, I don't think you guys have raise your hand, but you could unmute yourself and ask a question, and that would be okay now. Way to get a receipt of our attendance. I am happy. I think you're on the recording and you wrote that, so now it's going to be showing up. But I can take, I don't know. That might be a question for the managers of the of the meeting. I can try to find out though, and see if they can send it out to people. I'm going to put up a little poll that's kind of a feedback poll. Launch polling. Now, I would love it if you guys would answer some of these questions about kind of targeting these kinds of trainings. And I'm going to try to read through the notes here. Receipt of attendance. I'm glad people thought it was helpful. Okay, Tina registered. Justin, we did one of those at Molly Cross Health Run. I think it was 2008 in Bozeman. Not only, so sounds like Montana has already done some. And I will say, I want to be clear that, you know, a lot of this stuff, like the individual pieces, I've seen a lot already come out of Montana. I mean, like Montana has already done a number of vulnerability assessments and is thinking through quite a bit of this. So we've just kind of put it all into one giant piece here. What is the right scale for adaptation planning? The whole state, regions, or watersheds? Renee, that's a great question. It's really hard to, I think it totally depends on, what does it depend on? I mean, it depends on your, you know, are you picking a given species? Are you picking a ecosystem? So what is your target? You know, obviously you probably want to consider kind of the larger, you know, connectivity issues between multiple populations if you're picking a species or something, neighboring lands. I do think the scale, I would think about it as the scale at which you affect management action. So, you know, I really think you should always keep in mind like the management levers. So yes, you can't change climate, but what you can do is how you respond and the types of actions you take to adapt to climate change, and to really think about the scale is at which you have a management lever you can lean on. I think, you know, and I think it depends on the organization too. Like if you're an organization that's only concerned about sage grouse, then you might want to consider sage, you know, some population or something. I think it's hard to do at regions. I think it's great to do at regions because it kind of gives you that bigger context. I do tend to see it more at the state or watershed level. And I don't think there's any right scale. I think that's something that the group has to struggle with, thinking about, you know, what can we do? Where can we get the data? What does the ecology or the system or the species tell us about what to do? And where can we actually affect change via our management? Did that answer your question, Renee? Ish. Another punt. All right. Well, I'm not seeing Justin. I don't know. Okay. All right. So if you could please respond up to the the questions, that will really help me. And thank you so much for your time. I hope my email is awade, awade at usgs.gov. And I'm happy to try to email you a PDF of this stuff if you can't get into it. I'm happy to try to just send it to you. Might take me a couple of days, but I'll try. So thank you everyone for coming. I hope it was helpful, and go forth and prosper, be well. And yeah, climate adapt, plan for climate change. All right, thanks for your time, everybody.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks for coming.